Good morning, everybody. My name is Danny Perlstein. I am the Policy and Communications Director at the Riders Alliance. We are New York City's grassroots organization of subway and bus riders, and we're so glad that everyone here was able to make it today. There are good things happening in transit, and we wanted to bring that to everybody's attention. Foremost, of course, this is the month that people will remember as a point when New York turned a corner back toward normalcy, back toward recovery. At this point, transit riders, workers, and advocates have won $14.5 billion in federal aid to save MTA bus and train service in New York City for a generation to come. And that should take us through the next few years of reduced ridership while the system and the city together build back. And that's, of course, to the immense credit of our U.S. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and his colleagues in New York's congressional delegation who came through for riders over this, apocalyptic year of lost revenue and lost ridership. Even, as I'll point out, the system never dipped below 1 million New Yorkers riding every single day, and we've now achieved more than 3 million back on the system and are returning strong. But of course, we're not out of the woods. There are still threats to the revival, the recovery, and of course the equitable recovery of our transit system in our city. And unfortunately, one of those threats is embodied in Governor Cuomo's executive budget. And that is, of course, the threat to cut funds, just as the federal government is bringing us aid, but to cut dedicated tax revenue to the MTA and divert that to other state purposes. There are hundreds of millions of dollars worth of diversions, worth of raids in the governor's proposed budget. And we have to stand up because we know that even $14.5 billion alone from the federal government won't save public transit if the state chips away at the finances of the MTA, which have been utterly devastated in the past year. And so we can't let that happen because we know what that means. It means fare hikes. It means service cuts, the very things that keep people off of transit when transit needs most at this point is to recover ridership. And we have the federal aid to recover our ridership, but we can undermine all of that. We can trigger a death spiral of transit service and fare cuts anyway if the state makes these cuts, if the governor's raids go ahead. And so thankfully, there's an alternative plan. The New York Senate has put forth a budget proposal that eliminates the governor's raid and in fact brings in millions in new revenue to the MTA, new revenue that is starkly at odds with what the MTA would get from a fare hike off the backs of essential workers and New Yorkers with no other choice but to take transit. Progressive revenue in the state Senate's budget proposal would come directly to the MTA to stop fare hikes, to stop cuts, to support the restoration of service and the return of ridership. And so our first speaker today to address that is Senate Deputy Leader Michael Gianaris, a person who has been a tremendous friend to riders over the years, whose own organizing and leadership development efforts have led to a new generation of senators, many of them transit riders themselves, who have championed public transit since coming into office and, of course, helped pass New York's historic congestion pricing plan. So I wanted to turn it over to Senator Gianaris to hear a little bit more about what's in the Senate budget plan this year. Senator.
Thank you, Danny. I appreciate it, and I appreciate your advocacy. And I want to put some context on what you just spoke about. So over the last year, all we've thought about, spoke about is COVID-19, its consequences. That includes its consequences on mass transit. But I want to rewind a little bit further back because many of us were fighting since before the pandemic hit to increase funding for the MTA. It has been underfunded for years. It wasn't that long ago that the daily stories were about subway breakdowns and things that were falling apart as it relates to our subways and buses. So this was a need that predates the lack of ridership and the lack of revenue that the lack of ridership caused over the last year. So here we are now, the pandemic hits, people stop taking the subways, and the federal government does come in to help in a huge way. And so we definitely appreciate what they have done. But there are needs beyond just taking us back to where we were a year ago. And so that's why here at the state level, we cannot just allow the federal aid to give us an excuse to pare back state aid. We're accomplishing nothing if we take that money and then just lessen the dedicated commitment that the state has made. I'm proud that my colleagues in the Senate, I know Senator Hoylman, I think, is going to be on this call as well. But I'm proud that we, in our proposal that we passed last week, said we're not raiding any money from the MTA. And in fact, we're going to do what we should have been doing for years now, and that is increase our commitment to mass transit. It is especially important now because if we're going to get ourselves back to work, if we're going to engage in a robust recovery in New York, how are people going to get back to work? How are they going to get to school? How are they going to get to their doctor's appointments if they can't ride a functioning mass transit system? And so that is what our commitment has been. The worst thing we can do right now, and there's a lot of talk about tax hikes. We'd favor taxing the wealthy to do a lot of the things such as fund mass transit. But if all we're doing is forcing the MTA to raise fares because we're not giving them enough in state aid, then make no mistake about it, that's just a tax on working people. That is a tax on the people who can least afford it. And so when we're looking at people that have done very well over the last year, despite the economic hardship so many others have faced, it's only fair to say they should help fund this recovery. They should help get our mass transit system back on track and do so many of the other things that we're trying to do. We've got about a week and a half left until this budget is due. And I know that the Senate, we're going to fight very, very hard to get our proposal over the finish line and make sure that we stop the raids and increase the assistance that we're giving the MTA, in addition to what the federal government is doing, so that we can finally get the MTA on solid footing going forward and give us a mass transit system we can be even prouder of. But Danny, I want to thank you. I know Rachel Faust is on this call too. All the advocates that have fought so hard. I see Rebecca Balin, an alum of this effort, now working on the revenue generation side. But there are a lot of people that have been putting a lot of work into this for a long time. And I'm proud to consider them partners in this effort. Hopefully we have good news within a couple of weeks. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Senator. And you mentioned Rachel Faust. Rachel has been, leading the charge to figure out what's going on and to make sure that there is integrity in the budget process, in particular for something as mission critical as the MTA in the state budget this year. Rachel knows more than anyone, just how tricky and Byzantine these issues can be and how sunlight is the best medicine. Bringing these things into the daylight, drawing the attention that we need to them is such a foundational step toward stopping the raids, stopping the hikes, saving the fare, and saving service. So I want to turn it over now to my colleague, Rachel Faust, Senior Research Analyst at reInvent Albany.
Thanks so much, Danny, and thanks so much to Senator Gianaris and all the members of the Senate who are why we're having this important press conference today. Every dollar diverted by the governor away from the MTA is a dollar that riders are going to have to pay for, whether it's through a fare increase or service cuts. And the governor's budget diverted $145 million away from the MTA for next year's budget. And he's also seeking to take about $100 million from this year's budget. We thank the Assembly and the Senate for reversing the governor's raid to restore this $145 million from the MTA. And not only has the Senate reversed the raid, they've done the exact opposite of the governor. They increased funding for transit statewide, adding 10% from pre-COVID levels. Advocates didn't work hard to win federal dollars from the federal government, only for the governor, who controls the MTA, to abdicate his responsibility and reduce the state's commitment. Raiding dedicated transit funds also breaks trust with the public, who pay these taxes with the understanding that they will fund mass transit, not be used by the state for something else entirely. So now is the time for the Assembly to match the Senate and create new dedicated sources of revenue for the MTA and transit statewide, and ensure that all the money that was withheld last year is repaid to the MTA. Keep in mind that it was $500 million that the state withheld from the MTA last year during the worst financial crisis in its history. This is still at risk, and we hope that this money will all be restored. So thanks again to the Senate for this important proposal. This is where we need to go to get back the MTA where it was in the past, if not grow, because the MTA is foundational to our recovery. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I want to turn next to somebody who's been another champion for riders in the Senate for many years, and in particular this year has worked with us on the restoration of 24/7 subway service, which of course we can be proud is more than halfway back. And we look forward to having it all the way back very soon. Senator Brad Hoylman.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Senator Gianaris. And I'm so glad that our conference is out front in funding for the MTA. You know, if I'm Secretary Buttigieg, Danny, and I'm looking at what the governor's proposing in terms of rating dollars dedicated to the MTA, maybe I'm going to think twice about this, you know, the $6 billion that's allotted for mass transit here in New York under the federal stimulus plan. Or maybe I'm going to think twice about how those dollars are raised through congestion pricing. I think it is incredibly cynical and unconstructive to take funds away when the public messaging is the opposite, that we need the MTA to fight our way out of this pandemic. We've seen ridership tick up from 7% a year ago to almost a third. And we need continued confidence from business leaders, from riders, from public officials and state government that the MTA is the way to go. So let's not reverse those letters and make MTA the ATM for the state's fiscal problems. The MTA is the solution to our state's fiscal problems, and it needs to be fully funded. No raids, no way. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Senator Gianaris, for your leadership.
Thank you, Senator, for reminding us that this is not the first time this has happened, of course. You know, and governor's been in office for 12 years, and unfortunately, we've seen hundreds of millions of dollars raided in the past for many years until the legislature finally brought the lockbox bill, you know, down essentially, and unanimously enacted that legislation on the eve of congestion pricing authorization. And it's the spirit of the lockbox, I think, that we're all talking about, which is that money that's been dedicated to transit by the legislature when it's enacted taxes to support the MTA must stay in transit, must be lockbox. And unfortunately, this governor has all too often disregarded that principle, disregarded that practice, and taken money out of the MTA, used it as an ATM, and really used riders as an ATM, right? Taking money from MetroCard swipes, from tokens in the past, from bus transfers, from OmniNow, and used it for other state purposes rather than raising progressive revenue. And, you know, no one knows more about that than transit workers themselves. You know, that's why the transit workers have been tireless in opposing these raids and also fighting for the restoration of service that has been cut from the C and the F line in the three boroughs throughout the city. And so we have with us today TWU Vice President for the Manhattan and Bronx Surface Transportation Operating Authority, bus drivers, also Chief of Staff of TWU Local 100, Richie Davis. Can you please turn on your camera and say a few words? Join us.
Just give me 1 second to get the camera on, if you don't mind.
Thank you so much.
Okay, can you see me now?
That's great. Yep.
Okay. I'm actually here on behalf of Tony Utana, our president of Local 100, and it's been a tough year for us here at TWU with with the pandemic and the amount of members we lost, about over 100 members, and the transportation, buses and trains, been suffering a little bit of a ridership decline, and we're hoping that ridership increases. There's issues right now that we're having with the transit authority and not providing service, such as the F line. Even on the buses side, they're not actually covering what they call cover the work or cover the runs. They don't send the proper amount of buses out because they feel the ridership is very low. And we think that's a detriment to us here, because that will not make good with the ridership to bring them back to the bus if they see an enormous amount of people in certain lines riding the buses, and people are already afraid of the pandemic. So put them in an overcrowded bus, even put more of a fear factor of them even wanting to ride the buses. It's disturbing that I'm hearing that the governor wants to make certain cuts to the budget, and that's not good for us here at TWU, for our members and also for the riding public, which leaves us in a disarray at the moment. But our president, Tony Utana, has been working hard and fighting. And we, of course, at TW is in the field with our members and make sure we're trying to get the best for everyone with public and TW at the same time. I hope that my comments aren't too harsh, but I'd like to thank the senators on the call here for helping with these challenges. And I'd just like to say thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And, you know, one of the things you mentioned is so incredibly important, which is the overcrowded buses. You know, the idea that in the richest city in the world, you know, people are cramming onto buses during a pandemic. And, you know, I saw it myself. I was on the bus with my daughter on Saturday, and, you know, that bus was packed. You know, it was packed early on a Saturday morning. And I want to turn now to someone who has been bringing the message of abundance, you know, all across the state and building a historic coalition to realize the gains of New York for New Yorkers, to invest in our New York. And that's my former colleague, Rebecca Balin.
Thank you, Danny. It's so great to be here today and to be with Riders Alliance. And of course, a special thank you to Deputy Leader Mike Gianaris and Senator Brad Hoylman, who have been fighting for years, both for transit riders and for working class New Yorkers across the state. And so I just want to reiterate what folks have said here today. We don't need to divert funds from the MTA. We don't need to impose service cuts that will impact our essential workers. We don't need to raise fares that will impact low-income community members, essential workers, and New Yorkers of color. We have the money in this state to make sure that the MTA has all it needs and the rest of the state has all it needs. That's why we've been fighting for the Invest in Our New York Act. That's why we are happy that the Senate has put out a revenue package, a proposal in the One House budgets that have over $7 billion in new progressive revenue. And we are asking Andre Stewart-Cousins and Carl Hastie to hold the line with Governor Cuomo as they negotiate the budget, call for not a penny less. We actually do need more, of course, but this is a really important start. We cannot deal with a penny less. We can't allow transit riders to suffer, students to suffer, workers to suffer. We have the money. These raids are unnecessary. So that's all I want to say. I also forgot to introduce myself. I'm Rebecca Balin, campaign manager with Invest in Our New York. You see the Fair Fares poster in the background. Very proud of the hard work that we've done all together to make sure that people have what they need. But we don't have to, a fare hike and service cuts are regressive taxes. We can fund our subway system with progressive taxation to make sure that we just simply end tax breaks for the wealthiest New Yorkers so the rest of us can survive and thrive. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Our last speaker today is someone who has advocated strenuously for climate justice and also for maintaining access to the transit system for students who depend overwhelmingly to get to middle school, high school, and college across the city on public transit buses and trains. And that is Alexa Jacob from the Sunrise Movement NYC.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alexa Jacob. I'm representing the Sunrise Movement New York City Hub. I'm here to talk about climate justice in transit because I am a college student and many members of our hub are college students, high school students, middle school students. And as schools are reopening, we need safe ways to get to school, and that includes public transit. From a climate justice perspective, climate justice is racial justice, which is also economic justice. We need to support those who depend on the MTA, and that includes essential workers and our low-income communities. We know that our MTA will help take our region out of the COVID depression. We need to invest in it. This is a key part of the Green New Deal for New York City. Laws like the Local Law 97 and the Climate Mobilization Act have been really awesome and really important, but we also need to use the tools that we already have in our toolbox, and that includes mass transit. We need to incentivize people to use mass transit by not raiding the MTA, by keeping fares low, keeping service high, incentivizing people to use it. And yeah, exactly, that's what says my notes. So we need to preserve and enhance green solutions that we already have and also just make them better. That's all I have to say. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Alexa. Thanks everybody for joining us today. You know, we want to, of course, bring home the main point, which is that we have had these raids now proposed on the table for months. We now have a solution. We have a remedy. The Senate plan restores the money the governor raided and brings in new money to public transit. It's consistent with the federal aid we've received over the last year. It doesn't detract from that. It doesn't endanger the transit system the way the governor's plan does. It restores it, and it restores hope to the millions of New Yorkers riding it every single day now and the millions returning over this year and next. So with that, I want to open it up to questions. If you have questions, please turn on your mic and voice them or enter them in the chat. I think that we covered it. Thanks so much, everybody. If you have any other questions, you have my information, Rachel's, and Alex's for Senator Gianaris. Please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks so much for joining this morning.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.